Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Black Mirror Season 4, Episode 1, USS Callister. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review Season 4 of Black Mirror one episode at a time. In this video, I will cover the episode titled USS Callister. This video will feature spoilers for this episode, so if you haven't seen USS Callister, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. But this video will not contain spoilers from any other episode of Black Mirror, so if you haven't seen other episodes of Black Mirror Season 4, do not worry, I will not be getting into any other spoilers here. So before I get into the USS Callister, I wanted to talk about Season 4 of Black Mirror as a whole, spoiler-free of course, but just give some of my overall thoughts on the season. So my plan is to review each episode of Season 4 of Black Mirror 1 week at a time. Typically with Netflix shows, I review each episode or each season all at once, as they're all released at the same time. But I thought I'd make an exception for Black Mirror, as this isn't really like the bingeable type of show in my opinion. Each episode is its own story. In fact, this feels more like a collection of short films than it does a TV show. So I think each episode deserves its own special attention, regardless on how it was released. However, it was my original plan to watch each episode weekly, but once it came out, I realized that I did not have the willpower to do that, but I did limit myself to one episode a day. But I have seen them all at this stage, but only once, and I will rewatch and analyze each episode for each review that I do. So, my thoughts on Season 4 as a whole is, this is probably my favorite season of Black Mirror. I was super impressed with it and thought it was absolutely amazing. I say probably my favorite because it's kind of hard to compare it to the first two seasons, as there were fewer episodes in those seasons, but as far as Season 3 goes, I think this is very clearly an improvement. As in my opinion, Season 3 had 2 great episodes, 2 okay episodes, and 2 bad episodes. Whereas Season 4 has 5 great episodes and only 1 okay episode. To me, that is a vast improvement. And Season 1 had 2 great episodes and 1 absolute dog shit episode, the only truly bad episode of Black Mirror, which I won't name. Big fucking oh, sorry for the completely unrelated cough. Anyway, for that episode alone, I'd have to say this makes Season 4 better than Season 1. As for Season 2, it depends on if you include White Christmas, as according to Netflix, it's in Season 2, but technically it was its own Christmas special that came out a year after Season 2. So if you don't include White Christmas, Season 4 is clearly better, as Season 2 would contain 1 great episode, 1 okay episode, and 1 bad episode. But if you do include White Christmas, then it contains 2 great episodes, one of them being the best of the entire show. So then it would be more of a close call. But even then, I think I'd have to give the slight edge to Season 4 for the sheer amount of great episodes. So I know everyone has different opinions on this, but I love Season 4. As I said, I think there were 5 great episodes, to varying degrees. Some were better than others, but they were all great. And there was only 1 episode this season I thought that I wasn't really impressed with and thought was kind of just meh, but I'll get to that one in due time. For now, let me get more specifically into the USS Callister, and as I said, I will be getting full on into spoilers, so probably best not to watch this until you've at least seen this episode. So when I first saw the promos for this episode, I was wondering what the hell this would be about, as it looked like a Star Trek parody episode, something along the lines of The Orville, which didn't seem to really fit into the theme of Black Mirror, as Black Mirror typically is about the near future and typically doesn't jump that far ahead, particularly not into a space opera. And also, this was a clear parody of Star Trek in particular, which again seems totally out of character for Black Mirror, which has never been a straight-up comedy show. So, when I first watched this episode, which began with a teaser that did appear to be straight up a Star Trek parody, I was a bit confused until the Star Trek portion ended and it jumped into the modern times, and it was made clear that this episode was in fact very consistent with the typical Black Mirror tone and themes, as it was in fact set in the near future and centered on a virtual reality based game, which is very much in the tone of Black Mirror. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the Star Trek parody isn't the point of the episode, and instead is simply the setting. The main point of the episode is the story of a shy computer programmer who is pushed around by his colleagues using a virtual reality to torture and get revenge on digital versions of his workmates. The Star Trek setting is actually incidental, and this setting could in fact be anything. It could be Star Wars, it could be Lord of the Rings, or He-Man, and it wouldn't change the essence of what this episode is about. In fact, I heard several reviewers refer to this episode as making commentary on Star Trek, and I could not disagree more. In fact, I'd say as a Star Trek parody, this episode fails miserably, and it's obvious that the writers don't really understand Star Trek at all. In fact, writer Charlie Brooker has even stated in interviews that he's not familiar with Star Trek. This is in direct contrast to something like The Orville, where it's evident that the writers completely understand Star Trek, and that is in fact a very good Star Trek parody. However, don't misunderstand me here, because I'm not saying this negatively affects this episode. I just disagree with the interpretation of those saying that this episode attempts to make commentary on Star Trek, because I don't think that's the point. As I mentioned already, the Star Trek parody is just the setting on which the story about a tech genius torturing AIs is being told. So it makes no difference to me that this space fleet doesn't work as a direct analogy to Star Trek, because that's not the point. Whereas stories like The Orville and Galaxy Quest is more about being a Star Trek parody, so those are more dependent on their parodies being more accurate. But here, it's not the point, and it's just a setting. So it doesn't bother me at all that Charlie Brooker isn't really familiar with Star Trek, because that's not required for what the episode does. So let me give some examples about how Space Fleet isn't an accurate analogy for Star Trek. And because it just mostly resembles Star Trek on a surface level, because it focuses on the outdatedness cheese of the original series Star Trek, the 60s music, the melodrama, and over-the-top action sequences, and that's about it. Visually, it's pretty spot on. Of Star Trek, from the looks of the ship to the uniforms to the blue aliens and whatnot. But the similarities pretty much end there, as the depth of the story is obviously very simplistic and cartoonish, and does come off more as a two-dimensional schlock like Flash Gordon than thus robbing Star Trek of the credit it deserves as a groundbreaking, complex show known for breaking boundaries and taking risks, and its social commentary. And despite its outdated appearance, it's actually a very complex and thought-provoking show, whereas the stories in Space Fleet were obviously elementary and simplistic. For example, the villain presented in this episode was more like an over-the-top Flash Gordon, typical evil cartoon villain, where Star Trek did have some over-the-top villains in their day, but for the most part, there were a lot more complexity to that. Take, for example, the Romulan commander that appeared in Balance of Terror, who was calm, intelligent, thoughtful, the audience got to relate to him and identify with him despite the horrible things that he was doing. In fact, the episode did an amazing job of showing that he and Kirk are two sides of the same coin. So when you compare him to the villain in Space Fleet, you see no resemblance whatsoever. In fact, if you take Star Trek The Next Generation into account, that had several episodes where the whole point is to respect artificial intelligence and treat them with the same rights and respect as human beings, whereas the main character in this story, who proclaims to be acting in the name of Space Fleet, abuses and tortures artificial intelligent beings for his own pleasure. So All of this is what I mean by, as a commentator on Star Trek, this episode actually fails. But as I said, that doesn't matter because it's not what this episode is trying to do. It just uses it as a setting to tell a really interesting and fascinating story. So nothing against this episode. I just wish that people would stop saying this episode makes great commentary on Star Trek, because it doesn't even try to do that. In fact, if this episode is criticizing anything, it's Star Trek fans, as the main antagonist of the episode, who is cruel and petty as he takes out his frustrations on those who are defenseless, is a metaphor for a Star Trek fan. So I suppose I should be offended, but I'm not, because it's not really saying all fans are like that. Simply giving an example of how some escape into fantasy instead of facing reality. In fact, as I was watching this episode, at first I thought this would be another version of the Star Trek Next Generation episode Hollow Pursuits, which is about a crew member who uses the holodeck, a program that can create any environment, including people, with holograms, in order to escape from reality. As in reality, this character is just shy and he's being picked on and shoved around, but on the holodeck he's brash and commanding, and he recreates images of the other crew members that boss him around and make them more pathetic or shorter so he can easily boss them around. So you can see the similarities between these episodes. However, eventually they do take this episode in an entirely different direction. As in Hollow Pursuits, the point was to rescue Barclay from his escapism, to have sympathy for him, and that's really the direction I thought they were going to go with Robert Dailey in this episode, because they do show him being shoved around, belittled, and bullied by the others in the office, which makes the audience have sympathy for him. But instead, they go in an entirely different direction and portray him as a villain, one whom the audience can sympathize with and understand, but a villain no less. Because at first you do feel for Robert Dailey and how he's being picked on. It does seem at first it's going to be about him winning over the affections of the new girl, Cole, that actually appreciates him. But instead of trying to win her over, he simply creates a digital copy of her so he can torture her into submission, clearly establishing him as not a nice guy. In fact, it does show he has quite a sadistic side to him, because this technology he uses to duplicate people isn't widely available, so he goes out of his way to create it. In fact, he goes out of his way to keep these duplicates exactly the same as the actual people that he's duplicating, making them truly duplicates, where he probably could have reprogrammed these characters to be more like Space Fleet characters and be in the mindset that they were always in Space Fleet and belonged there. Kind of like what Barclay did in the holodeck. But instead of doing that, he keeps them exactly the same, so they are essentially the same people that he knows, and instead of reprogramming them, he tortures them into doing his bidding and makes their whole existence a torturous nightmare. And it's clear he does this on purpose, and it's apparent to me that much of the enjoyment he gets out of playing this game isn't the enjoyment in playing around in his favorite show, but a sadistic pleasure he takes out of torturing these people into submission. This is very apparent to me and especially in that scene when, after his partner Walton in real life yells at him and says, "I'm not asking, I'm telling you," he goes straight to the game and yells and degrades the digital version of Walton as a form of revenge. He even goes as far as to repeat the same phrase of "not asking, telling." In addition, when Parker wasn't that receptive to getting him a coffee in the office and the program, he orders Parker to give him a coffee. So it's obvious the point of this game is to indulge his feelings of cruelty and his need to dominate people, something that he can't do in real life. And that's why he is a villain and deserves what he gets at the end of the episode. This is exemplified in the line towards the end of the episode where digital Walton is talking to him and saying that he should apologize for taking advantage of him and all of the nasty things that real life Walton has done to him. But then he says, "But then you threw Tommy out an airlock, so fuck you to death." So really, this is saying, yes, the people in the office were mean to him and he didn't deserve to be treated that way. But what he did in retaliation of creating digital copies of them so he could torture them was much worse. In fact, this episode reminded me a lot of the Black Mirror episode White Christmas, more specifically the part about the cookies, as that was an example of how a person's consciousness could be duplicated into a digital form, and also in that episode it was about torturing these digital versions into submission, which was John Hamm's character's job. Although he didn't do it out of pleasure, but has a means to an end in order to get these artificial intelligence to behave, but still the meaning is the same. So that was only one tiny aspect of White Christmas. This episode explores this a lot more. In fact, is more of an adventure type story about these abused AIs fighting back. Whereas in White Christmas, it was presented simply as the bleak way that it is. Here we see the AIs actually striking back. So this episode does ask wider philosophical questions about the ethical treatment of artificial intelligence, who are essentially just copies of real life people. But this episode makes it clear these are perfect copies who think and feel just like the real life people do. In fact, that was kind of the point, as Dailey would get a much more sadistic pleasure out of torturing them because they think they are the real people. So here I think it's clear it's presenting them as fully sentient beings, as it presents a happy ending where the cruel torturer is defeated and left to the fate he deserves, while the other innocent victims escape and are finally free to be themselves. However, if one were to look at it from Dailey's perspective, and these programs are nothing more than emulating life and are just lines of code, then one could like it to like a killer machine story where autonomous anything, just plain lines of code sabotage the human player and kill him. Like, think about if you're playing a video game where you go around shooting characters, but these characters are sick of being shot and tortured, and they find a way to shoot back at you and kill you in real life. Then it becomes more of a tragic horror story. I guess it all depends on one's perspective. However, it is clear that the episode is presenting the perspective of these are sentient beings who don't deserve to be tortured, and thus their escape and death of Robert Dailey is presented as a happy ending. And make no mistake, he does die. As they made it clear, the office was closing down for 10 days over the holidays, so no one is going to notice him trapped in his game where he would likely die by starvation by the time they find him. In fact, I think the story itself, the reason why it sets over Christmas is specifically for that reason. However, even though this is presented as an uplifting ending with happy music, I do still feel there is an intended dynamic there of the tragedy of Dailey's death. He was simply an abused and unappreciated programmer who didn't deserve to die for just messing around within 8 lines of program. Which is why I think this ending is so brilliant, because nothing in Black Mirror is as clear-cut as it appears to be. And what about real life Cole? How is she going to react upon learning about Robert Dailey's death? And basically it was because of her actions. This could in fact ruin her life. So you could also see it as a digital Cole screwing over her real life counterpart in order to gain her freedom. Again, as it kind of has a killer robot feel to it. And I'm not advocating for any one interpretation over the other, but just pointing out how this makes this an amazingly dynamic story. Also, there's an element of commentary about how people tend to take on a less caring and more cruel persona when using digital formats such as the internet. This comes in the form of Dailey's own cruel persona of being a malevolent torturer while he's in the game, but just a normal shy guy when he isn't. And of course, there's Aaron Paul's cameo when he's the online gamer who's just immediately a total dick, speaking to the attitude that some have as soon as they go online. as Cole and the crew were really excited to be alive, but the others were simply using it as a game. And by the way, Aaron Paul's cameo was pretty cool. A lot of people are, of course, pointing to Breaking Bad because that's what he's most known for, and also, of course, Jesse Clemens, who plays Robert Dailey, also appeared on Breaking Bad with Aaron Paul. But his cameo here actually reminded me more of his character from BoJack Horseman. I suppose that's because the way this is only a voice-only role, just like that show. But when I was listening to that character talking at the end, I was just imagining Todd from BoJack Horseman speaking. And another useless trivia fact is Todd was also the name of Clemens' character from Breaking Bad, but whatever. Anyways, this episode did have a lot of effective uses of humor, like Paul's appearance, but it always blended it seamlessly with the dramatic story being told, which I think was very masterfully done. One thing I particularly love is how after they pass through the wormhole and the 60s mod disappears, they have a generous use of lens flare. And in fact, the bridge actually turns on to look more like J.J. Abrams' Star Trek, and I actually find that a nice touch. However, I do have some questions about Infinity. Is it a space game entirely? And what's interesting is that earlier in the episode, when Robert Dailey is in the lobby trying to gain access to the office, you can see on the screen playing behind him an ad for Infinity, and basically shows the USS Callister Abrams lens flare version that we see at the end of the episode. But that's very obviously an updated version of the Space Fleet ship. So is that what the Infinity game is about? Is it a Space Fleet knockoff? And if so, why was Cole so surprised when she saw that Space Fleet paraphernalia and Dailey's office? But yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's not. Maybe that was just a fun Easter egg. But still, the question remains, is it only space, or can these characters we follow eventually try to go into other environments as well? I don't know. Perhaps that should have been made a bit more clear. Other issues I had with this episode is there were some things that happened toward the end of the movie where they were trying to be more suspenseful that felt a bit forced and fake, kind of in a Hollywood way, if you know what I'm saying. Like the way Cole was begging Dailey to go swimming with her. She was really acting weird, and it felt fake that he would actually go with her. Also, someone else pointed out, does Dailey not have the ability to simply leave Infinity when he's on the planet and then re-enter Infinity on the USS Callister instead of chasing after them in the shuttlecraft? Also, I would add, does he really need to be on the USS Callister to use his user powers? I mean, couldn't he just turn them all into monsters from the shuttle? And the whole chase scene with the asteroid felt really out of place as well. As did when Cole in real life was breaking into Dailey's house to steal his stuff. I mean, I know she really doesn't want those photos being released, but still, I don't really buy that she'd go that far. I mean, this wasn't that big of a deal, but all of this stuff would be, kind of would be the typical level of suspension of disbelief that most Hollywood blockbusters like superhero movies would have. But I don't know, I kind of expect more out of Black Mirror, but that's just me. So my rating for USS Callister out of 10 is a 9 excellent. Overall, an amazing story that used the backdrop of a Star Trek parody nicely to tell a very fascinating story that tests the boundary of how real AIs are, and we basically get to see abused AIs fight back and root for them. Kind of like in Westworld, and it did feature one of the same actors from Westworld as well. It was a great character story that was exciting and funny and had very satisfying and thought-provoking payoff. However, it's not without its flaws, including the suspension of disbelief being a bit higher than I would have preferred in some scenes, but still, this was a very fun action-adventure. So that's it for my review of the USS Callister. I will be back here every week to review each episode of Black Mirror Season 4, so be sure to keep an eye out for that, as well as I cover many other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek The Expanse, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.